Hey, folks, welcome to Free Press Sports with Carlos and Shawn. Unfortunately, we don't have Carlos Menards today. He is out, but fortunately for y'all, we've got a couple of dudes that actually know basketball, and so Carlos doesn't, so that's a plus. And since we're in the middle, or not in the middle, but we're about to start the NCAA tournament, I think it's the way we need to do it this week. So we're going to welcome in Graham Couch, who's a columnist at the Lansing State Journal and knows all things Spartans, and he likes to think all things, everything, right, Graham? I mean, that's kind of your MO, right? I know everything and nobody else knows anything. I think that's a good way to describe it.
Yeah. Mostly beer league, softball, and chess.
And pick up basketball. And I'll be curious to see how it goes when you tell our next guest, Ant Wright, what it's like when you're in a pickup game and you want to establish your dominant presence and you're pulling up from 40 feet the first time you get the ball.
I will be curious. I'll be curious to his reaction to my initial pickup game strategy. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Ant Wright, who's a huge presence in our area on social media, played basketball at Michigan. So he's probably the only one of the three of us that actually understands the game, or at least understands the game at a higher level. He also does a lot of things. He's got a media group. Welcome, Ant. Tell us a little bit about some of your companies and what you're doing these days.
For sure. I'm the owner of Wright Media, and one of those legs that we have is Full Ride Network. Right now, we have about a dozen websites that is focused on collegiate sports. Two of those are from Michigan and Michigan State. It's bluebyninety.com, BLUEBYNINETY.com, and then SpartanShadows.com. And they do an excellent job. We're on pace for over 1 million page views with our brand new websites. This is our third month with those, and we are on track to just do a great job throughout the spring, summer, and into football. So check those out for sure.
Well, thanks for joining us, Ant. And let's get right to it. But before we start, look, so much of what we do, we all three live in this world of this Michigan State rivalry. It's obviously more heated for football, but it's gotten that way for basketball to some degree, or at least close to it. And before we get into, hey, Kobe Buffkin or Jaden Akins, and we'll do a lot of that. And one of the things, by the way, Graham Ant is really good at is player breakdowns. He does it for high school players, right? Yeah. So we'll get into that a little bit. But just both of y'all's overall thoughts on Michigan State, where they're at, where they're headed, and we can talk about whether each coach is feeling any pressure, what kind of pressure. But let's start with you, Ant. Just kind of what's your thoughts so far on what Michigan State is doing and what kind of chance they have in the tournament, and then what you've seen from Michigan?
I like Michigan State's chances in this tournament. I think they have a great opportunity. Now it's up to them to seize it, but I think they have the second easiest route to the Final Four. Like, it's not easy, but the second most manageable route to the Final Four out of all the Big Ten teams that I've been really looking at. I think Purdue is first, but I think they're both in a very manageable region. There are a bunch of seeds who I feel, if you were to pick any of the 4 seeds that are on a certain line, that you would want them. So out of like the 2 line, right? Out of all those 2 seeds, I think that you would want a Marquette team. And a Marquette team that is younger, that is a bit new to this whole scenario. They were successful in the Big East this year, but still, it's still a brand new type of thing. When it comes down to just how they're able to operate, they didn't play well in the Big Ten tournament, but the games leading up to that, they've shown that actually throughout this year, they've shown when they're able to shoot the ball, they're a really hard team to beat. And if they're able to just manage to do that throughout, because they got shooters, they have Akins, they got Walker, they got Hauser, they have guys who can really shoot the ball. If those guys are shooting the ball at a decent clip, they're going to be right there every single game.
Graham?
Yeah, I mean, I think, his analysis of Marquette is interesting because the one thing I really like in Michigan State's early matchups is neither of their potential, their first-round opponent, USC or Marquette, has the position and the player that can really hurt them inside. Like, they don't have that, and they're not going to hurt you on the glass. And that to me is where Michigan State really gets hurt beyond days where they just miss shots, is when they get beat up and they can't keep people off the glass. And the game gets hard for them and they lose out on possessions. And then they're just, they already play a brand of basketball because they don't get a lot of easy buckets at the rim that you're going to have days where the sport just isn't easy and it's just not falling. So that element not being there allows them to sort of be a little more strength on strength, I think, and I think gives them a decent shot. And I think this team has, and Shawn, you and I have talked about this too, a little more to it than some of their other 7 or 8 seed teams in terms of potential to get beyond the first weekend. Doesn't mean they're not just as capable of losing to USC. We've seen them do that, but they've also been a team, I think, every time that they have had to win a game, sort of found a way to do it. Like, it felt like every time there's a little bit of a close to back against the wall situation, and they were never really on the bubble this year or anything, but there would be games where it felt like, boy, this is kind of a needed win, and they'd get it. And so that's a trait, a characteristic they seem to have to them. And I am what they played like in the last 4 games of the regular season before the Ohio State game, and some of the offense they found. And Akins, I think, was a big part of that, because it creates just one more shooter that becomes. You saw, like, at Nebraska, there were times where you're really picking your poison defensively. They just got a lot of guys, and they could finally, for the first time all season, you saw them overwhelm a team offensively when they were shooting like that for a few games, and that was new. So I'm curious to see if they can get some of that back.
You know, it's interesting to me that USC, I know the early scout from the state folks, that they see it as a team that's, you know, they're athletic. They have size in the perimeter. They got one guard who's 6'8", maybe he's even 6'9", and like you said, Graham, they don't have the big. But to me, when I look at USC, and I haven't watched them a lot, I'm sure Ant's seen them a lot more. But from State's perspective, what they've seen on film so far is that, you know, they get up on you defensively. Offensively, they don't do much more than high ball screens, maybe a couple of things here and there. But this is the kind of team that, I mean, can present problems because of the athleticism. But Izzo's had his way on and off over the years with these kind of teams in the tournament. I'm thinking of LSU, for example. Not a perfect comparison. A few years ago, the year they beat Duke in the regional, I think they played LSU in the Sweet 16. That was a very athletic team, but and State wasn't as athletic that year. But they just sort of picked them apart with Winston and McQuaid and Goins and those guys. And so I wonder what you see, Ant, in terms of the USC matchup, because obviously they could lose, but this is where Izzo can thrive when he's got the right kind of team for him.
For sure. I mean, I pulled up their synergy stats here to kind of back up exactly like who they are. They about 6 guys they run their offense through. Of these 6, these are the only 6 with at least 190 possessions this year. That's to be led by Boogie Ellis and Drew Peterson for the most part. You know, Boogie Ellis is going to be the better shooter on the perimeter. And then you're going to have Drew Peterson is going to be more so your creator, along with Kobe Johnson. This is a more so of a guard-led team. And any backcourt matchup that Michigan State can get into, I think it's going to favor them, because I like Michigan State's backcourt as being one of the best in the country, especially when they're all playing at least just average. Like, they don't even have to play great. At their average, they're still top 10 to me backcourt in the entire country, and, you know, top 2, top 3 in the Big Ten.
Let me ask you, Graham. So speaking of their guards, it's interesting. I was talking about this with somebody the other day. We've seen Walker go for 30, 20. He's capable of that. They've lost a couple. I mean, Purdue is the most obvious example. Purdue at Breslin, when he went for close to 30 or 30 or whatever, and they still lost. I mean, he's electric, and he's obviously a 3-level scorer. But to me, when Hogarth's engaged, it's different, right? I mean, Walker can put them on their back a little bit and keep them in a game. But when Hogarth's engaged, it has a ripple effect to me that's a little bit different, and it lifts everybody else. Yeah. And I think that's why Izzo's so hard on him, harder than anybody else on the team. And I'm curious, first of all, where you think Hogarth is, and because he didn't play well in the first half against Ohio State, you saw Izzo go down and sit in the middle of the bench with him, right? And in fact, you talked about that the other day. But where do you think Hogarth is, and what's your sense of the guard play?
Yeah, Walker's kind of the guy who rescues them, and Hogarth's the guy who's rolling when they're rolling. That's sort of, Tyson Walker's, he's a guy that can be an equalizer when they're facing a matchup that they don't quite win, like Zach Edey, and he gives them, he's better than, he gave Purdue's guards fits. He's done that a few other times. But yeah, Hogarth is, one of the more interesting people I've covered in that regard. And I talked to him the other day about the situation with him and Izzo on the bench. And, I mean, I have a feeling that conversation and that response has happened many a time. And, Hoggard just said, I didn't realize quite how viral it was going to go. I think you sort of forget you're on national TV and you're having this moment. He was upset with himself. I've talked before about the idea of some people don't have great resting faces, like Jim Harbaugh. He's got that gaping mouth open, looks like he's confused. Like, I think there's an industry out there, like, where you can be a consultant for people to teach them. Jim Caldwell had this problem. He always looked confused. Smart guy, look confused, right? Like every time the camera cut to him, they should have people come around and like, this is what you want your face to look like. Hoggard could use that. Hoggard could use, when Izzo is yelling at you, here's the face, right? And, but he's very aware of it at this point. And the question is whether he is going to put together, a really focused tournament. He really came out of the scene last year. You remember that Purdue game in the Big Ten tournament? And then, that was sort of...
When he got up into Ivy.
Yeah, that was sort of like, okay, wow, this guy can actually be a problem. And he was a guy, had no shot last year. Now he's got at least a decent, at least capable of shooting. And yet he could still get in the lane and be a problem downhill. And you couldn't just, completely sag off him. I think so much of what Michigan State's ceiling revolves around him, which is probably a problem for Michigan State because they need. But I also think you're now at the NCAA tournament where Izzo plays the long game with him, and he will bench him, not caring if they beat Ohio State, trying to get a message home for what's to come later in the accountability. I do wonder if he gets a little bit of a longer go now, even when he's struggling, because Izzo understands that, like, it just doesn't help them to take him out when he's struggling. The drop off between him and Trey Holloman in terms of ceiling and other things is severe. Now, the one thing that worked a couple times when he was struggling, and I would expect they go to this in a single elimination tournament, is they just put the ball in Tyson Walker's hands at like Ohio State on the road this year, and sort of went back to the days where they played him a lot in the point guard, and that worked. And he's, so I don't know. You can't trust AJ Hoggard in terms of consistency, but I think when he's right and he's headed downhill, and I think he's the guy that other coaches probably fear the most.
Defensively too. Defensively.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I want to ask you this, Ant. Let's stay with Hoggard here for a second, because I remember you mentioned that Purdue game, Graham, last year in the Big Ten tournament, and he was great. It was sort of shocking, actually, how he got up into Ivy. And did that actually at the home game against Purdue. But the game that sticks out to me is the Duke game, because Gabe Brown hit a lot of shots in that first half. But the reason they were in that Duke game toward the end and had a legitimate chance to win, to me, was because of Hoggard and his swag, right? Do you and the way he was attacking? What was the big guy's name? Williams? Was it Mark Williams? I can't remember. But the way he played against Duke and and we were sitting courtside, you could feel that. And that's been really inconsistent this year. But for Ant, I'm curious, first of all, what do you think of his ability to kind of take over and his physicality? But do you agree that he is the barometer in a way, even though he may not be the most skilled offensively?
I do, because, the thing with this whole backcourt is that they don't play just on one end. Like, they are two-way dogs on both ends. Akins, two-way guy. Tyson Walker is a two-way guy. He's smaller, right? He had a little bit of issues with Bruce Thornton because he had him by about 40, 50 pounds. Yeah. But, two-way guy. And AJ Hoggard, two-way guy. And his defense on some of the better players, like last year, him guarding Boo Buie, him guarding Johnny Davis. He made Johnny Davis look silly.
He did.
Very silly. Just defensively, just getting up in guys, just being frustrating, being quick enough, but then being big enough to where you can't really knock him off his block. He's all of 215. I don't care what he's listed at. He's plus 10, whatever that is. He is a big dude at 6'3", and he's so quick, and he has the mentality to play. He has the I'm not going to lose this possession mentality. I don't care who you are. I'm going to beat you in this possession. And when you have someone like that, that just makes everyone behind you play that much harder and that much better, not trying to let him down. Now, from an offensive standpoint, that's kind of where, it's been a little bit up and down, and it's mainly because if his shot is going, if things are going in his way, he plays up to it, right? If he starts, turning the ball over, getting some charges, he can get frustrated. That all impacts his game. He's just got to be real mellow, real chill. Doesn't need to play excellent, just needs to play above average for him to be good on the offensive end. And then defensively, that travels. You don't need to have a good or bad day on defense. Just go out there, play hard, trust your instincts, and trust your talent. And he can stop anybody in the country at the 1 or the 2 spot, in my opinion.
He's an interesting guy in terms of I think the way he feels out of games sometimes doesn't work with Izzo. And that's been – so I think part of the – people say, well, slow starts and he'll pick up a charge here or foul. I think sometimes he's figuring out what the game's going to be. And in doing that, and sometimes they don't let him do that. And that's that, you don't want to get off to a horrible start here and there. But if you watch his sort of understanding of game situation, he's the only guy when they're losing against Northwestern at home. He tried to take that game over and nearly did and brought him back. When they're at Indiana and maybe it was Purdue, one of those places, and it was going horribly. He can take it to another gear and put people on his back. And he understands, okay, this is a moment where I got to do things differently. Nothing else is working. And when things are best for Michigan State, he's whipping the ball around and he feels like he's got it on a string and he's having fun with it. I think sometimes what happens early in games is misinterpreted as him not caring or being focused. I think he's trying to figure out the game. And sometimes that they don't let him do that enough.
Well, frustration can sometimes look like something else, right? Like, or when you're tight. I felt that about Michigan. I've been arguing with some Michigan fans recently in the game against Rutgers in the Big Ten tournament. There were a lot of part of the fan base didn't think they were engaged enough or cared enough, which I've never liked that. You're talking about a college athlete who's out there who works all the time to be in that position. And, Phil Martelli was saying after the game, look, we were it overwhelmed us. They felt like they were playing one tournament game after another to get to that point. And then the stage just got them a little bit. It's a young team. It's the youngest team in the Big Ten. And because they were anxious, that can then slow you down. You know how it works in your synapse? If you're upset or worried or nervous about something, then you're thinking a little bit. And then it slows you down physically. So that can read as apathy or you're not engaged, when in fact it's the opposite. You care so much it's slowing you down. So I wonder sometimes with Hoggard, it's not apathy or tightness as much as maybe frustration that's having a similar physical effect, because mentally, and Ant can speak to this, you played at a high level. But real quickly, before we take our first break, I want to get your guys' thoughts on Izzo. And because as you know this, Graham, there's a chunk of the fan base. It's funny, after they lost Ohio State, I was getting texts from alums that I know that have worked in the business. Journalists are like, they're not sports people, but they're like, okay, it's time for him to retire. You get this, and we've gotten this the last couple of years. Do you feel like Izzo, and he talked about getting to the second weekend the other day, the team talked about it. Do y'all feel like there's any pressure? Does Izzo feel any pressure because he has not been to the second weekend? And I know COVID interrupted it. That COVID year, he had a team that was good enough to win it. But what's your perspective, both of you, on this?
I don't think pressure. Go ahead, Ant.
Yeah, go ahead, Ant. Sorry.
I mean, this would be really quick. I don't think anybody puts pressure on getting to a Final Four or winning a national championship again more than Izzo himself, honestly. And I don't think the outside noise is really anything that he pays much attention to, unless it's aimed at his players. Then he'll speak up and speak out. But anything geared towards him, I don't think bothers him one bit. That's just me.
All right, no, I agree with that. He was bringing it up the other day, though, Graham. You were there.
So there will become a point where it will bother him that they haven't gotten to the second weekend, and I think this is probably the tipping point for that. Like you'll notice, like with the Champions Classic, at a certain point, losing to Kentucky, Duke, and Kansas at a certain percentage was starting to bother him, and that became a big deal. Like winning that game became a bigger deal to him for the only reason that he didn't like that his program was being viewed as like the fourth school there. And you could just tell. And I think internally, this would be 3 tournaments where they don't get to the second weekend. If they don't get there, where they don't feel like an elite program, they feel like a middling NCAA tournament team. I think that would start to bother him. Now, I think if they didn't have, I mean, he knows what everybody knows. They have a really good class coming in. They got a lot of guys probably coming back, and especially with this sort of weird extra year situation, they've got a chance to have sort of an ideal mix of seasoned, really good college basketball players and some higher end freshmen next year. And that's the ideal team if you can put it together. So I don't think, it's not like it feels like this has to be the year, but I do think he knows he's got a team that's a little better than maybe last year's team, certainly the team 2 years ago. And he also knows he's the guy that didn't give, he can say what he wants about the center position. And I've talked to him a lot about the decision to stick with the guys he had and, go with Mady Sissoko. But there's no doubt that the rest of the roster with a good big man, it could be an elite college basketball team. And so you've chosen to go one way. And I think he knows that he has the other parts to get somewhere. And I think he'd like to do it. So I think there's internal pressure, but I don't think he's certainly after, first of all, he doesn't live in social media as much. So he's able to ignore a lot of things, but I don't think he feels anything outside.
Well, I think I saw Ant tweet this out within the last week. It was talking about the classic, the best Izzo teams have been built on great guard play and then just sort of formidable. I think he used the word formidable. I can't remember exactly, but a tough interior presence, not necessarily high scoring interior. For example, you put junior season Tillman even sophomore Tillman put on this team, and this is a completely different team, right?
100%.
So, yeah,
even Nick Ward, man. Even Nick Ward,
Yeah, you put Roy. Why do I always keep saying Roy Marble? It dates me way too much back to the Iowa teams. You put Julius Marble on this team. He's having a good year at Texas A&M, right? So, all right, look, let's take a quick break, get some sponsors in here, and we'll be right back with more Free Press Sports with Carlos and Shawn, and we will dig into Michigan. Welcome back to Free Press Sports with Carlos and Shawn. All right, we were just talking about pressure and Izzo, which is sort of silly, for all sorts of reasons. But Ant and Graham, speaking of Juwan Howard in pressure, I don't know that he's feeling it one way or the other. I certainly don't think he's on the hot seat. I know, though, that what's happened this season, especially what's happened in the last few weeks, has really frustrated a lot of the fan base. And it's funny, I wrote a column, was it last week or the week before? And at that point, they had not played at Illinois or at Indiana. Basically, the argument is ridiculous that Howard is on the hot seat, that the team had showed improvement. I think they were 6-2 at that point in their previous 8 games and had gotten themselves in a position to at least fight for an NCAA tournament bid.
I know this column well, Shawn.
Yeah, and then if nothing else, that in a down year, if you still show improvement, you got a couple of guys that are developing, particularly Kobe Buffkin. Doug McDaniel was getting better too and more comfortable. The fact that you lost your point guard, just the circumstances that not every year is going to go perfect, but the idea is in a hot seat. Anyway, I've taken so much flack. And by the way, when they were in a game with Toledo on Monday night, Tuesday night, God, I can't remember the dates. Twitter started blowing up again at me, saying, "Look at this! They can't even beat Toledo." That column, and it was just ridiculous. And what's funny is, from my position, Michigan fans were pissed at me for defending Howard. Michigan State fans were even more pissed at me because they think there's a blue. Yeah, they think there's a blue wall at the Free Press, which is ridiculous. But I'm like, look at whatever about Izzo. But anyway, let's start with you, Ant. What do you think of? You're tapped into this. You played there. You know this community. What's your sense of the feeling about Juwan these days?
First of all, RIP to your mentions, man. I saw that war and I veered right around. I'm like, I'm not going to get in there. I'm not going to.
I jumped right in. I jumped right in.
Graham
tried to defend me. I don't get in there, but Graham tried to defend me.
Man, he took out the sword and all those horses coming at Graham. Graham's like, I'm with you. I'm like, no, I'm about to just watch from afar. But what I feel is, you have the fans who are going to back the coach no matter what. Then you have the other fans who have been spoiled by John Beilein's teams in the past, and there's some division there for sure. I think what's missing is a lot of nuance and context, especially for this year, which, some of it does fall on Juwan with how the roster is constructed and struggling in a non-conference where I think if you're a little bit older on the perimeter, it probably gets you through some of those tough games. It probably gets you through maybe beating Virginia when you're up double digits. You're beating a very mid North Carolina team. You're probably challenging also a very mid Kentucky team at the time. They've come along lately to make them a 6 seed, but they weren't very good in those first couple months, right? And I think that you see these situations and then you bring up the record in like 1 to 2 possession games comparing Beeline and Howard, and they're like 1-12 this year in like 1 to 2 possession games, and then Beeline had like an over 500 record with like 15-6, 15-7. So a lot of it is because of in 2019, Beeline's last year, fans were let down. They won 30 games and went to a Sweet 16. Like, fans were let down from that year. And this feels far from that. So some fans are like, this was our down just a few years ago. Now our down is being the NIT. So there's a lot of like a civil war going on right now. When it comes to the hot seat, his seat's not hot. This is the first tournament he's missed. This is a roster that very young on the perimeter, with like Doug and Kobe especially, they've gotten a lot better this year. When Jalen Llewellyn went down, Doug came right into it, and Doug is not the same player as he was back in November, December. Kobe Buffkin, he had an outstanding offseason. I was watching the exhibition game, and in the first 10 minutes, I talked to the NBA draft chat. I'm like, Kobe Buffkin lottery in 2024. Like, just watch it, just 10 minutes. And then now you see what's going on with him. Like, there's no surprise to me. Outstanding offseason. But these younger guys, they still needed minutes. Kobe just turned 19 in September. You have Doug, who's a true freshman. Jet, who's a true freshman. These perimeter guys are playing a lot of minutes, and they had to really grow up, and they had to go through a bunch of lumps. And some of those lumps you want to go through and still win by a little bit, right? You don't want to lose those games. It's much easier to get better on a lump that you win than you lose. And those losses kept stacking up on the right side of the column. And it's really frustrating for fans seeing that of their, 15 losses this year, 12 of them have come by they're probably 4 or 5 possessions away from being like a 7 or 8 seed, which is insane.
Or better.
Yeah.
Frankly.
What was Michigan?
They were in second place in the Big Ten not that long ago, right, Grant?
What was Michigan preseason ranked?
They were they ranked? They're like 20 something.
Right. So this to me should be a reason we get rid of the AP poll. Like, you can't, like, you got to be better than that as an AP voter to understand a team with young guards is going to struggle. Like, you got to know that. You can't just look at Hunter Dickinson and say, yeah, junior big man has been an All-American. If you've got young guards in college basketball with a decent early schedule, you are going to struggle. And I think that's part of what happens with any season is the perception coming into the season, right? And that was Michigan dealt with some decent expectations because they had the returning big man. And yet when you to the point of your column, Shawn, when you watch like Doug McDaniel February, it's just that's a different guy than the beginning of January. And that's what happens. That's what you want with freshman guards. Buffkin has become one of my favorite college basketball players to watch. And I know he's a sophomore, but this is his first year at that level.
He didn't play much last year, did he?
Yeah. It's a different deal. And then Jet Howard, that's a whole, I do think there was some, it's hard to overcome some of the defensive mishaps there. And they probably, I know this kid, I don't want to wade into this battle, but they probably needed a little less of him on the court and then he played a little more accountability on certain things defensively. But nonetheless, you got a young backcourt. This is sometimes what happens. It's not entirely surprising.
And people are going to come in and say, well, what about Purdue? First of all, Purdue's backcourt is young with 2 true freshmen. At the same time, they could lean on Brandon Newman, who was a third-year player, Ethan Morton, another third-year player, I believe third-year player, and then you had David Jenkins, who's a fifth-year guy, who are right there to hold them up and who are right there to rub shoulders with in the film room, rubbing shoulders with in the weight room, in practice, when watching things, and when they're on the bench, when they get subbed out, they get to be taught by not just the coaches, but by the elder statesmen. So, but before people want to say, but Purdue, I do want to give that context.
Yeah,
plus they have forwards too. They have forwards too, right? That have a fair amount of experience. First, and the other fellow's name escapes me, but so their whole front line is veterans. Whereas Michigan, it's not just the perimeter guys with Michigan. I mean, Reed and Cheddar are both really, really young, right? So there was just. I mean, they're the youngest team in the Big Ten, and I don't think it's close. I'm with you. I'm with you both on Bufkin. I was surprised at the backlash I got. I mean, people forget. We're talking about State. So Izzo had a team with Winston, Bridges, Ward, and Langford, and they were all freshmen. And that team barely got in, right? And they had to make a push at the end of the year. And they had all that talent because they were young. I mean, what was Cassius Winston like as a freshman, right?
Probably not playing enough, but yeah, they're playing tum-tum there.
Yeah.
But
no, for sure.
No. Yeah.
And speaking of Cassius Winston, and this will get into a conversation we're going to have here in a minute about Ben Carter and Jaren Jackson, but we'll save that just for a second because Cassius Winston to me is related to that too. That in any case, yeah, there's example after example. I thought, and Graham, it was fun to see you sort of try to defend me on Twitter with this, but the idea that they went, 6-2, and then they go to Illinois and Indiana, and Ant's played in both those places. We've covered games in both those places. I grew up around Champaign for a bit. That's one of the best underrated sneaky atmospheres in college basketball. In Indiana, right? Yeah. In Indiana, and it's loud as hell in the Assembly Hall. In Indiana is very, very similar. And so the fact that they took both those squads, good tournament squads, on the road to overtime, I mean, I felt like they played their best ball. And I've talked about this with Martelli in Chicago the other day, that when Michigan State came, the Michigan State game, it was obviously very emotional, and it was a really, really beautiful human night in so many ways. But overshadowed was that both those teams played their butts off, and I would argue they looked the best they'd looked all season, both of them, and it was a high level game. And then both of them went from there and played great until they got to Chicago. They sort of carried that momentum, but it felt maybe a little uncomfortable to talk about it that night because of all the other things that were happening and the emotion. But I feel like that's what shocked me, Ann, about the backlash was that it was pretty obvious that Michigan was playing its best ball when you want them to play its best ball, and that says something about the staff. Forget the roster construction. I mean, that's a different issue, and I know that's going to have to be addressed. But what was your take on that night?
I mean, you got the backlash because it was definitely the headline, right? The headline got people going, and I don't think a lot of people read that. But with that night, there was, like you said, a lot of emotion, and both teams were playing very, very well. I believe the game was tied with 3 minutes left?
Something like that, right, Graham? Yeah.
Tied around 62 or something like that.
72, yeah.
Yeah, and then they hit a couple big threes, one by Hunter, one by Kobe, right? And then that was pretty much the game.
Yeah.
And they finished that night, which is something they hadn't always done.
They never finish. Yeah. They never finish. Yeah. They don't finish games, and they could be up by 10 with 3 minutes left, and I don't care. I'm like, what's going to happen now? Are they going to execute? Are they going to rebound? Are they going to do the little things to go ahead and finish this game? And a lot of times this year, they didn't. They didn't execute. And if they did execute, something would happen that would be against them. And then they would have to get a stop on defense, which didn't happen a lot. So they were just put in these really tough situations. End the game. You have to make this play. And more times than not, that play was not made or it was made against them.
We should get into the Jaden Akins, Kobe Bufkin thing, Shawn.
Yeah, let's do that before we finish up and go back to everybody's favorite topic in Ben Carter. Yeah, no. Yeah, no, because Ant was talking before we started recording. Ant was giving us a great player breakdown. But do you have any quick thoughts with this setup, Graham?
Well, no, I just think one of the interesting things, and I enjoy Ant's breakdowns and analysis, but one of the things he's been fervent on is the idea that Akins and Bufkin aren't really that. What separates them is the roles and what they're asked to do more than anything.
Length also,
and so I was just hoping he could get into that and we could chat about it for a minute.
Yeah, because State fans, I've heard some State fans say, okay, well, why is Bufkin on the NBA draft boards and Akins is not? So yeah, let's get Ant's thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, it's fairly easy. Is it's the roles that they play. You have Kobe Buffkin. He's probably put over 150 possessions this year out of the pick and roll, right? Where he's coming off, he's making decisions. What's the NBA? The NBA is a pick and roll league. Whether it's in the middle third of the court or the left third or the right third, he's coming off and he's making decisions, whether to score or hit someone, whether to hit the roll, hit the pop, hit the left, hit the right wing, hit the opposite corner, go ISO himself. He is in those decisions all the time. When it comes to Jaden Akins, he's in those concepts a fraction of the time. 66 to 67% of his shots come out of spot ups and transition, but he thrives in those. I'm not saying that it's a knock on him. All I'm saying is that talent-wise, I don't think there's much of a difference between Kobe and Jaden Akins. All I'm saying is that, Akins is in a situation where he's playing alongside with Tyson Walker. He's playing alongside A.J. Hoggard. So the ball isn't really in his hands, and he's not given the same responsibilities off the dribble to make decisions, to come off of screens and see what's there and kind of just operate, which is completely fine. That's just kind of how Michigan State is running things, but that's good right now because just based off of how their team is built, the way that Michigan is built, Kobe is one of two people who could make any play off the bounce, and Kobe's taken that opportunity and just ran with it.
It's interesting you say that because in Chicago, a buddy of mine who does not watch a lot of Michigan State. He and I talk all the time, so he hears about them. But it was his first time this year seeing them live. So he got the Ohio State game, and that comes with all sorts of opinions. And he's always down on the Big Ten anyway. But his big takeaway on Michigan State was, and there were a couple possessions where Jaden had the ball in his hands, and he was like, they need more of that. Like that's a guy. It felt like that was something that gives them a little more juice, and you can sort of see it. And I will be curious moving forward because this is where it gets interesting with who comes back next year and how roles change. Because if Tyson Walker comes back, what does that then mean for Jaden Akins' development and growth to that next step? And those are things that I think are delicate. And also, frankly, I'm pretty sure Jeremy Fears is not counting on Tyson Walker coming back either. So, but those are things they're going to have to address because you have to change year to year and you have to let players grow, and that's going to be interesting to watch.
They reached out to a guard in the portal, the Butler guard too, which kind of threw me way off. So I'm not even sure if there's something else there in the background happening, whether they expect some movement there.
No, it should be interesting. Real quickly on Akins, one thing that he's just shown he can do this since a freshman, but he's been doing more lately is the 1-2 dribble pull up, right? Especially attacking a closeout, but pulling up from the elbow or the nail or wherever, and it's just. He's so quick. I mean, that's Buffkin is obviously a better playmaker because of reps. Maybe he's just a better playmaker because he sees the floor differently.
I think it's reps, honestly.
It's hard. Yeah, I think it's reps too. He's a little longer than Akins. I think Akins has got a little quicker first step. And
he's more explosive than Akins.
He's definitely got more bounce. But that pull-up is because he's so quick, he can get whatever he wants. But all right,
hold on. And here's the one other thing about that is, Akins missed all of September and October, and then a good chunk of November and into December. So the team was kind of formed without him this year, and then he had to come back, and you sort of. Whereas if you're going to be a ball handler, a primary guy in the offense, that's a tough thing to then rework in. So it would have been interesting. I don't know how different it would have been. Maybe not at all in terms of his role, but based on the conversations that I had with Izzo last summer, and I think just talking with Akins over the summer at like the Moneyball Pro-Am and what they thought. I mean, I don't think they thought this was exactly going to be his year. I mean, I think the injury too had something to do with how the team sort of formed without him and the offense came to be.
No, Izzo's talked for months about that. He's got so much more to give. They feel like he's just scratching the surface, and you can see these moments. Plus, the way Ant mentioned this earlier, the way he gets up in you, right, and the way he defends. He's dropped off just a touch as his shooting started taking more shots. I think that's natural.
He's the one. Like when we sit courtside at Breslin, there, and we talk about all this time. What games could you see yourself in a pickup game and be able to hang and be okay? And this is where I'm delusional. But Akins is the one guy that, like, when he's defending, I'm like, I would hate that. Like, that would be the worst. Like, if you draw that aside, that guy who's just into you, he's more athletic, he's attentive. Yeah. It's like, not this guy. Today's going to stink. They're going to, yeah. So anyway, that's
Yeah, no, it's like an average guy thinking they can guard Curry or whatever because he's not as quick as Kyrie. You know what I mean? It's just ridiculous. But okay, so speaking of the last subject here, speaking of the evolution and point guard play and so forth, and just roles and how they change, I want to get into everybody's favorite topic that'll never go away around here. It's the Ben Carter, Jaren Jackson kind of moment with Michigan State, Syracuse. And my thought is we can talk about it. I want to hear your all thoughts first, but I want to throw this out there. I don't think Izzo still regrets that move. I think the thing that, and Graham and I have talked about this before, the thing that he regrets about that season, which he's admitted, is that he didn't put the ball in Winston's hands, that he let the team run through Bridges more. Because we saw what happened when he got the ball the next year, right? They got to the Final Four, and then the next year there was some tragedy. But when he looks back on it, he's like, I wish I'd given the ball to Winston and run more high ball screen offense instead of worrying about Bridges as much. And that's the regret. He has no Ben Carter regret. But what are y'all's thoughts here? 7 years later, 8 years later, of the infamous bringing in Ben Carter from Las Vegas to replace the number 4 pick in the draft.
Let me give mine before we give to the guy with some actual knowledge here. I actually didn't hate it. I liked, because I mean, they were in a tough spot. They went 7 for 35 for 3. They missed a lot of shots that day, which was bad. But they didn't have a lot of options. And he mismanaged that team. He had too many bigs, because you remember the year before, Carter and Schilling got hurt, and so they came back for like a 6th year. And then he played Bridges on the wing when he may have been better at the 4 in college, but that was sort of a promise as you're coming back to go to the pros. You know, that he just didn't. He had a really talented roster. I don't think he managed all that well. And then Cassius Winston, just by the metrics, is like the most efficient player in college basketball, and yet the offense didn't run through him enough. It was kind of, but that particular day, everybody talks about Jaren Jackson, and Jaren Jackson was a pro. But sometimes, and Michigan's dealing with it this year, you get the pro in their developmental year, and what you're getting eventually isn't what they are as freshmen. And Jaren Jackson was flummoxed at it. He didn't have any answers. He struggled. He was out of sorts in the locker room afterwards. He really didn't have the know-how and developed skill to get them out of that situation either. And Ben Carter had a little more of it if they'd hit some shots. Now, I'm one of the few people who thinks if they would have went to him earlier, let him get more comfortable and done some more of that, it might have helped. But I am usually alone in this argument, or maybe sitting on an island with Shawn.
No, I'm with it. Okay, it's Ant's floor, but this is my 2 cents on that. When Carter came in the game, he immediately started getting better because he came in and he played in the middle of the zone. His kickouts and reads were just a lot better than Jaren Jackson's. And then Langford and Winston and those guys immediately had better shots. They still didn't make them. But technically, from a basketball strategy viewpoint, the decision made sense. Not only that, Jackson was foul prone. I think he had foul trouble. And so he either had to be in the middle of the zone or running the baseline. Well, Tillman, who was a freshman, actually came in and did a better job of running the baseline that night. But that's my 2 cents. Having said that, Jaren Jackson is 100,000 times more talented, so I understand the argument the other way. All right, the floor is yours, Ant.
All right. So my biggest thing is that you put someone in the game. This is a 1-game elimination tournament who's came into that game with 12 to 13 DNPs. I think you have to lose with your horses. And he played more minutes than both Nick Ward and Jaren Jackson Jr., who were really good at finishing around the basket. Now Jaren was, I believe, 0-4 in that game. Didn't shoot the ball particularly well. But I think you stick with that knowing that he was efficient, that he was an efficient player, and that was just a blip. I think you have to go with Ward, JJJ, going baseline, and I think you have to put Miles Bridges at the free throw line, not 30 feet away from the basket, which is kind of, to Graham's point, which I questioned coming into that season. I'm like, Miles Bridges may be a 3 in the NBA, but he's your perfect college 4.
Absolutely.
6'7", super athletic, can shoot it, would own any matchup at the 4 against any team. Maybe their other team has some lottery talent. I don't care. I'm taking 2-year Miles Bridges against any of them. You're going up against the zone, you beat a zone from the interior. If you're a really good passing team and a good threat on the inside, Miles Bridges could do all of that. Whether he catches the ball at the free throw line, shoots it. Free throw line, it's one-on-one between him and whoever's in the middle. I trust Miles Bridges going 1 or 2 dribbles and finishing around the rim, getting fouled, getting to the line, or making the right lob pass, the right bounce pass, or the right skip to shooters. And then you're going to be in pick and roll with Bridges and Cassius Winston on the ball, because Bridges is going to be the one setting that outside screen so Cassius can get in the lane and make things happen. He has a nice floater, a nice pull-up, and he's really good at finding guys, whether it's on the baseline or for the opposite lob in the dunk spot. I just thought that was the wildest game, the wildest mismanaged game I've seen in a long time. I know Fife is all about Ben Carter being there, but I disagreed with them straight up. And I was like, look, you didn't lose with your horses. You gambled and you lost to a team who had to finish that game with a walk-on playing on the bottom wing. And that cannot happen, especially if it's a close game.
That's completely fair. I just the point I go back to is that as soon as Carter came in, the shots became a lot more open because he could read from the middle. Now, to your point about
putting guard him, that's why.
What's that?
He also didn't guard him that much.
Oh no, right, but he could pivot, but he could take the pass and pivot and kick it to where it needed to go, which Jaren Jackson couldn't do. Now, your argument about Bridges in the middle, that probably makes more sense. I didn't think Jackson looked good on the baseline either. I thought actually Tillman looked better, even though he was a freshman that year, and he's a better rebounder, right?
So those guys, honestly, any of those guys going baseline to going from block to block or running the baseline based off where the ball was, I thought that was fine. But there's nothing that Ben Carter could do that Miles Bridges can't do several levels higher.
What they really
to me, that's the better argument, right, Grant? The better argument is that Bridges should have been in there over Carter, but people
not 30
say,
feet away from the basket.
No, I completely agree.
Like 5 feet off the 3-point line. They totally neutralized Bridges out of that game. It just didn't make sense.
On the other hand, if they make 2 shots, we're not having this discussion.
But
what were they? What did you say? 7 for 35?
Yeah, I think it was 7 for 35 or 3. Yeah, if that's but is that the year? I mean, I feel like the Syracuse made like 2 or 3 of those runs from an 11 seed or whatever it was around that era where everybody would see it in the ACC all year, and they were a bubble team and they weren't that talented, but they were long. They knew what they were doing. And as soon as they faced, and that's what the Big Ten's got to hope in this NCAA tournament, right? Is that as soon as you step out of league play where everybody's seen you a million times and it's sort of figured you out, that you're going to have some advantages. It hasn't worked the last few years, and we'll see if it does in some of the matchups here. But I remember that day just thinking, like, how is this Syracuse team not undefeated? They look like the longest, most connected team, and Michigan State did not. But that whole season, Michigan State did not look connected. Like, they won 30 games and a Big Ten title and all that, but they weren't.
Michigan picked them up. Michigan picked them apart in New York.
Absolutely.
You remember that, right?
Yeah.
They abused them.
Yeah,
they weren't as good as their record, honestly.
No, they weren't.
That year, they beat 2 tournament teams. Yeah. I think that was Purdue and then Bucknell in the NCAAs. Outside of that, I don't think they beat any team. And I think they played the top 6 or the top – because they were part of the top 7. The other 6 of the top 7, they only played once that year.
And isn't that a good reminder? They lose Jaren Jackson and Miles Bridges, and they're better the next year, right? And Ant, do you agree with Izzo's sort of regret that he should have put the ball and built the team around Winston, even that at the beginning of the year, like when camp started?
I believe that because I think Cassius is one of the best basketball players to come through Michigan State and
ever.
Yeah, ever. I mean, you're talking about one of the best point guards. He's right up there with Mateen, in my opinion. So, and Magic. Like, I know those are legends, but I think Cassius is too.
Do you ever think about what might have happened with the COVID? Because that year, obviously, he lost his brother at the beginning of that year and struggled, right? Rightfully so. But by the end of that year, with the way even Rocket Watts was balling, but Henry's defense, Tillman was the best defensive big in the country to me that season by the end of the year. You remember that. But the way Winston sort of rediscovered himself, you don't know what happens with that team, but he might have had a chance to cement the legacy you're talking about, right?
I'm going to pop your bubble here because the teams that Michigan State fans look forward to the most, bad things happen to. You know what I mean? I think.
Well, I'm not a Michigan State fan, but yes, I understand what you're saying.
They were playing better. They were playing as probably top 3 team in the country going into the postseason. I agree there. But I just think those teams that you're looking forward to going to a Final Four and you're like, this team can win a national championship, bad things happen. And
that's fair. The one thing that team had that I recall thinking gave them a great shot was Tillman had reached the point where if they ran into a team that relied on a forward or a five to score, that team was going to lose because Tillman was shutting down. It was like Lamar Stevens one day,
Garza the
next. Like just the different types of bigs that he had reached a point that was like, holy smokes. So you began to trust that a little bit. That said, you're right. That's the one day that, he turns an ankle or winds up in foul trouble, or there's, that's the thing about the tournament, right?
Or somebody makes shots, the year before. Maybe you did, Ant. Who thought they were going to beat Duke?
I did.
Did you?
Did you?
Oh. A bunch of freshmen. I mean, I saw them lined up as who they were going to face if they get to the Elite Eight. I'm like, this is what you want. I mean, you're going to face a team super talented, but you're going to be playing against a very young team. Like, I know Zion, I get it. But from a matchup standpoint and from a veteran standpoint, you guys had everything needed to go and win that game.
What do you mean, you guys?
Michigan State.
I'm kidding.
Hey, it's all good.
I'm kidding. Hey, I'm curious, Ant, before we end this, and I know Graham needs to go, you need to go, but how is it for you rooting for Michigan? Because you played there, but you do, I don't want to get too flowery here, but your social media presence, the way you talk about games, the way you opine about Michigan State is pretty objective. And I'm curious how much of your fandom is still in there because you're an alum and you played there and that you've got an emotional attachment. That means something. It should mean something.
I want them to do well, but I've taken the emotional part out of it, which has been very nice for my psyche. And I've definitely moved towards being more of like a cheerleader for the Big Ten altogether because the national perception of the league is kind of annoying. It's kind of irritating. And, I'm always going back. I'm always going back for the Big Ten in general and less so like, ooh, Michigan this, Michigan that. Like, I couldn't do just Michigan stuff. My brain would explode and no.
It's interesting because you but you upset some of your Michigan followers and fans
all the time. Like some of them have me blocked and all this. I don't really care, but
because you're fair to other teams. It's interesting.
So I piss people off, and I know that.
To that point, though, I'm curious what you think. You mentioned paths earlier, Michigan State and Purdue to a Final Four. I'm curious if there's a team in the league like I become. The Big Ten for me becomes like that sibling that you're happy to criticize, and then somebody from the South criticizes, and you're like, "Screw you, man!" And like you're like, "This is not your place." Like the Big Ten's the best, and so I become strangely protective, bizarrely, and I have no reason for it. But and so I want this year to be the year that they put like 4 teams in the Sweet 16, and it's like there's the depth. It was more than depth. There was some really good teams there. I'm wondering who you look at and go. Like Purdue, I think, is a popular upset pick. And I know Memphis and Florida Atlantic are tough second-round matchups and all that stuff. But I think Purdue's still
they got to get past that game.
Yeah.
That's the biggest one. That's a tough draw for Purdue, honestly, is that Memphis FAU draw. Because I think both of those teams are not going to be afraid of Edey, and they got the backcourts to go at Purdue. But yeah.
Is there another team you like? I've kind of given up on Illinois. There's just been way too much inconsistency. For like 20-minute stretches, I'll think that's a team that can make a run, and then I don't think they're very connected. Illinois
got the hardest draw.
Yeah.
Illinois got the hardest draw of the 8. Maryland got the second hardest draw of the 8. But altogether, the East Regional and New York, that is, in my opinion, the most wide open region. And then I think the Midwest is the second most, but the South and the West are both really, really tough. Like really, really tough in my opinion. Because you got Kansas in 1, then the other one's got Arizona as a 2. Then I think NC State and Creighton can make a run to a Final Four just because how good their backcourts are. It's just that's a really tough draw for Maryland and a really tough draw for Illinois too, because Illinois has to play two possible lottery picks in the backcourt, and backcourt is where you get to that next level. And then if you get by them, it got to play Kansas, who has Jalen Wilson, who's been playing at a first-team All-American level, Grady Dick, who has been one of the top freshmen this year. He'll be a first-round draft pick, probably a lottery pick. And then they got the little point guard who just kind of just owns everything. And any team that has a good backcourt is going to be trouble for Illinois. And they got to face two of them back to back. And then if you get through that, you probably got to go through like a UConn, VCU. I mean, even St. Mary's got like Aiden Mahaney, a freshman, very, very good. Iona with Patino. Illinois got completely destroyed here. And they got trolled. Which is unfortunate.
But they did.
Yeah, I don't think
they did it to themselves in some ways too, though. So.
All right. Speaking of trolling, before we end, Graham, tell Ant your theory real quick of pickup ball, and then we want to hear from Ant. What was the sweetest bucket you had? What's the best player you gave the business to?
Well, so if I walk onto a pickup court, now I'm 43 now, so this has been a few years since I've been doing this regularly. But when I was in my lower 30s, and I walked onto a court where you're the white guy on a court where not a lot of white guys and they don't know you. My first shot would be from like 25 feet, because all you got to do is hit the rim. And if you hit the rim, they look at you and they go, shooter. And then there's respect. And then the whole game, that's the shooter. But if you take a 16-foot shot and you airball it and you got some guy guard, you never see the ball again. So the key is right away, just have the cojones to shoot from 25 feet. I mean, it's got to be open. It's got to be rhythm. You can't just jack something up. But look like a shooter, and you don't have to hit the shot. And then from that point forward, you've given your shot. You've given yourself a chance at some early respect. I don't know. What do you think of that?
It's really interesting, Ant, that it's just the perceptions when it comes to that in basketball. I was my son played and was a pretty good player. He played at Ann Arbor Skyline, and I coached the Skyline team in the fall. I was an AAU coach for a while, and I coached the Skyline team in the fall for a couple of years. And our best players were, you may know him, Brandon Wade was on that team, and his brother Ryan, and so forth. And Keith and I used to talk all the time when they were young. I watched Skyline lose, and I went to the game with my son, who's getting into coaching at Lincoln the other night. They lost a really tough game to Belleville. But anyway,
who's your son?
His name is Sam Windsor. He played some on that team as a senior, and we had an AAU team that was pretty good, but not. So my kids were Division II junior. Like my son played at junior college level, Division II. But the fall team I had for Skyline was Brandon both the Wade guys are Division I players and so forth. But Keith used to talk about going into a gym when his kids were younger. They're both light skinned. And then I had another kid that I coached too, Jack Ammerman.
Love Jack.
Who could shoot. He's like a 5'10", Klay Thompson, right? Just and so quick release. Anyway, Keith would talk about, Graham, you'd walk into the gym, and because Keith's a little darker and his sons were really light-skinned, that people would make assumptions, especially other black folks, that they were going to be soft and they had all this kind of stuff. And it was just, and he loved going into Detroit or to Flint with his team when his kids were younger, because they thought, oh, we're just going to work them. And then they'd go just give them the business, right? And I love that when I got to coach them a little bit in the fall league, because these guys are really good. But anyway, so to Graham's point, to what Keith was talking about, I'm curious about your perspective on that, Ant, and the stereotypes that people have when it comes to basketball.
For sure. First of all, love Jack Ammerman. He's over at a D2 in Hawaii right now.
Yep.
Tore up his knee, but he'll be back next year, I believe. So he has 2 years in Hawaii, so good for him. Love Brandon, love Ryan, love Keith, outstanding family. I'll say that much.
Absolutely.
When it comes down to, when it comes to stereotypes and all that, like, you have to, Graham was kind of on point, and everybody has to find their way to stand out, especially if you're new somewhere and guys don't know you. So when I would come back from Oak Hill or even Michigan, and I would go to a pickup, I don't wear any of my gear. I don't wear any Oak Hill stuff. I don't wear any Michigan stuff. I don't want anybody to try to relate me to something that's really good in basketball. So what I would do is in the first 2 or 3 possessions, I would make sure on the very first miss from the other team, I would go and get the rebound and I would smack the ball on the rebound as hard as I could. And me being 6'5", 6'6", usually one of the taller players, I would then run the ball as point. And the first player who's guarding me is usually the other team's tallest player. It could be anywhere between 6'4" and 6'7". He's more of a big man. And first thing I would do is I would try to hit him with the quick combo, get in the paint, throw it off the backboard, and dunk it.
Well, that
was my thing to establish myself as I'm here, I'm playing. If my team loses, you need to pick me up type of deal. So that's what I would try to do every time. If I couldn't throw it off the backboard, I would just try to just dunk on somebody, or I would shoot like a 30-foot 3-point shot. But yeah, you have to establish yourself in the first 2 possessions, or you are going to be low on the food chain, which sucks. Funny. You never get another shot.
No, it's true. And Graham, that's funny. I don't know that you and I were throwing it off the backboard to ourselves. It dunked it. I remember one time I used to go play pickup ball in Detroit a little bit in the late 80s and early 90s, and I was on the court one time I hadn't been on, and I was the only white guy, and I didn't even warm up. They just like, get in, get in, get in. And as soon as I got the ball, several other guys on the other team were like, shooter, shooter, shooter. And I couldn't shoot. I was like an old man. I had an old man game at 6'3" or so on the block. I had a lot of I played like Kevin McHale at 6'3", and I could work guys over. You can get them going one way and you go the other, but I couldn't shoot from 25 feet or whatever. But they just yell out at me, shooter, shooter, shooter. It was funny.
But that happens to me now when I show, and I'll even say if I miss 4 or 5 straight, that's the way I stay on a court. If I hate playing outdoor rims because it's shots off, the wind's hitting you. And I was playing with some young guys a couple of years ago, and I'm missing every shot. And one of the guys was like, looked at me like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "I'm 41 years old, and I'm out here with a bunch of 18-year-olds. I can obviously do something well. Give me the ball." Like, and I had to like give him that level of confidence. I wasn't sure I was ever going to see a shot go in that day because it wasn't happening. But I would, look, if there's a 41-year-old guy in the court with you, he does something. So just deal with it,
100%.
Oh God, we could sit here and talk about this all afternoon, but we need to get you guys out of here, and we need to wrap it up for our poor listeners. They don't want to hear our war stories. We want to hear more Ants. I mean, throwing it off the glass and pulling up from 30 and that sort of thing. But
I've got stories for days.
Yeah, I'll bet. Well, listen, thank you both for joining us. It's nice to finally meet you, Ant, after reading your stuff and watching your breakdown videos from afar. It's a pleasure. I'm glad you're in the market. You bring a lot. You bring a lot. Graham, you know what you do too. You, besides wear a golf cap from the 1920s, which I think is not so bad. But in any case, thank you guys for coming. And maybe we can. Go ahead.
Does Graham foresee any pledges upcoming for Michigan State sports at any level?
Maybe some super lean, some super interesting guys. Yeah, that's what's funny is for a guy who's so anti the word recruitment, I have no idea when recruits are when I'm so out of that world that when it happens, I'm always taken aback and surprised. And
it kills me every time. Every time there's a commitment, I run to your page just to see what you say. And then there's a decommitment, I run to your page.
That's
the funniest hill that's
kind of of the number of hills I have to die on. That is
well, the one last week where you're defending me, where you're saying overtime losses on the road are better than
obviously you'd rather win at home than lose on the road. But what's more impressive is getting to overtime on the road than getting to overtime at home when there's all
against a good team. Yeah.
I think my point was valid. I don't know.
No, I was grateful, man. I was like Ant said earlier, you got the swords and the horses are coming, and you're up there doing your thing. No, that was great. All right, well, let's get you guys out of here. It was fun. Maybe we could do this again at some point. I want to thank you, the listener, for joining us here at Free Press Sports with Carlos and Shawn. You can obviously find us wherever you find your favorite podcasts, at Spotify, at Apple. Graham probably has his own band out there, own place. He's got his own special pod network. I don't know. You can email him or hit him up in the DMs to find out about that. But we want to thank Robin Chan, who produced us. We want to thank Anjanette Delgado, our editor, our sports editor, Kirkland Crawford, and again, thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next week with more Free Press Sports with Carlos and Shawn.